Marcos stared at the cracked mirror in his small, dimly lit apartment. The face that looked back at him was a far cry from the confident executive he had once been. His once sharp eyes now carried the weight of a man who had lost his way, and his previously well-groomed appearance had given way to an unkempt beard and disheveled hair. 3 years had passed since his life had unraveled spectacularly. Marcos had been at the pinnacle of his career, a senior executive at a multinational corporation, when the pressure finally became too much. The long hours, constant travel, and relentless pursuit of success had taken their toll. He had ignored the warning signs, the sleepless nights, the panic attacks, the growing sense of emptiness, until it was too late. The day of his breakdown remained a blur in his memory. Marcos vaguely recalled standing in the middle of a board meeting, his heart racing, unable to breathe or speak. The room had spun around him, and then darkness. He had woken up in a hospital bed, diagnosed with severe burnout and clinical depression. In the aftermath, everything he had worked so hard to build crumbled away. The company, fearing bad publicity, had quietly let him go with a modest severance package. His wife, unable to cope with his sudden transformation from a dynamic go-getter to a shell of his former self, had filed for divorce. Friends and colleagues, once eager to be in his orbit, now avoided him like the plague. Marcos turned away from the mirror, his gaze falling on a framed photograph on his cluttered desk. It showed a version of himself from what felt like a lifetime ago, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit, arm around his ex-wife, both of them smiling at some corporate gala. With a sudden surge of emotion, he grabbed the frame and hurled it across the room. The sound of shattering glass echoed in the small space, a fitting metaphor for his shattered life. As he bent to clean up the mess, Marcos noticed a letter peeking out from beneath the broken frame. It was from the rehabilitation program he had half-heartedly joined at the insistence of his therapist. He had been putting off opening it, dreading whatever well-meaning but ultimately useless advice it might contain. With a sigh, he unfolded the letter. It was not what he had expected. The program had arranged a job placement for him as a gardener at a pediatric hospital. Marcos almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Him, who had once closed multi-million-dollar deals planting flowers for sick children, his first instinct was to crumple up the letter and throw it away. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the realization that he had nothing left to lose, or maybe it was the tiny spark of curiosity about what such a drastic change might bring. Whatever the reason, Marcos found himself considering the offer. As night fell outside his window, Marcos sat in the darkness of his apartment, the letter still in his hand. He did not know it yet, but this moment, this decision, would be the first step on a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, purpose, and the healing power of human connection. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital grounds as Marcos approached the imposing building. He clutched his worn backpack, feeling out of place in his faded jeans and work boots. The weight of his decision to accept the gardening position hung heavily on his shoulders. As he made his way to the administrative office, Marcos observed the bustling activity around him. Doctors in white coats rushed past, nurses wheeled patients through corridors, and worried family members huddled in corners. It was a world far removed from the corporate boardrooms he had once dominated. The hospital's head of facilities, a no-nonsense woman named Helen, gave Marcos a brisk tour of the grounds. She pointed out the areas that needed attention: overgrown flower beds, withered shrubs, and patches of bare earth where grass had long since given up the fight. Marcos listened silently, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task before him. His first days on the job proved challenging. The physical labor was grueling for someone who had spent years behind a desk. Marcos's hands, once soft and manicured, quickly became calloused and dirt-stained. The sun beat down mercilessly, and his muscles ached with the intensity he had never experienced before. But it was not just the physical demands that tested Marcos. He struggled to shake off the feeling of humiliation that washed over him each time a staff member or visitor walked past. He imagined their pitying glances, their whispered judgments about the fallen executive, now reduced to manual labor. On his third day, while tending to a small garden near the pediatric ward, Marcos had an encounter that would alter the course of his journey. He had been so focused on his work, angrily attacking a particularly stubborn weed, that he had not noticed the young girl watching him from a nearby bench. "You are doing it wrong," a small voice said. Marcos looked up, startled. The girl could not have been more than 10 years old. She sat in a wheelchair, a colorful blanket draped over her legs. Despite the pallor of her skin and the absence of hair, her eyes sparkled with a lively intelligence. "Excuse me?" Marcos asked, more harshly than he had intended. The girl was unfazed by his tone. "The weed. You are pulling it wrong. You need to get the root, or it will just grow back." Marcos stared at her, torn between irritation and amusement. Before he could respond, a nurse appeared, gently chiding the girl. "Sofia, you should be resting. Let's get you back to your room." As the nurse wheeled Sofia away, the young patient turned back to Marcos. "I will show you how to do it properly tomorrow," she called out, a mischievous grin on her face. Marcos watched them disappear into the building, a mix of emotions swirling within him. He had come to this job seeking nothing more than a paycheck and a way to pass the time. He had not expected to be schooled in gardening by a child, nor had he anticipated the spark of curiosity her words had ignited. As he resumed his work, Marcos found his thoughts drifting to Sofia. He wondered about her story, about the illness that had brought her to this place. For the first time since he had started this job, he felt a glimmer of something beyond his own misery, a faint stirring of interest in the world around him. The sun was setting as Marcos packed up his tools for the day. He cast a final glance at the spot where Sofia had sat. Tomorrow, he thought to himself, tomorrow he would learn how to properly pull a weed. The following morning, Marcos arrived at the hospital garden with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. To his surprise, Sofia was already there, seated in her wheelchair beneath the shade of a large tree. Her presence, unexpected yet somehow comforting, marked the beginning of a routine that would shape the coming weeks. As days passed, Marcos and Sofia developed a quiet understanding. She would appear in the garden whenever her health permitted, sometimes to offer gardening advice, other times simply to observe Marcos as he worked. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Marcos began to lower his emotional defenses. He found himself sharing small details about his former life and his fall from grace, things he had not spoken of to anyone since his arrival at the hospital. Sofia listened without judgment, her young face often bearing an expression of wisdom beyond her years. She did not offer platitudes or empty reassurances. Instead, her presence and occasional insights provided Marcos with a new perspective on his circumstances. He began to view his work in the garden not as a punishment or a fall from grace, but as an opportunity for reflection and growth. As their friendship deepened, Marcos became increasingly aware of the challenges Sofia faced. There were days when she did not appear in the garden, confined to her bed due to the side effects of her cancer treatment. On other occasions, he witnessed her struggle against nausea or fatigue, though she rarely complained. Her resilience in the face of such adversity stirred something in Marcos, a mix of admiration and protective instinct he had not felt in years. One particularly difficult day, Marcos found Sofia in her usual spot in the garden, tears silently streaming down her face. The news she had received was grim. Her cancer was not responding well to the current treatment, and her doctors were recommending a more aggressive approach. As Sofia confided her fears to Marcos, he felt the weight of his own problems diminish in comparison. That evening, as Marcos returned to his small apartment, he reflected on how his life had changed in the past few weeks. His friendship with Sofia had awakened feelings of compassion and purpose that he had thought long buried. He realized that in trying to help Sofia face her battle, he had inadvertently found a path towards his own healing. However, Marcos was careful not to romanticize their situation. He knew that Sofia's road ahead was fraught with uncertainty and pain. His own future, while perhaps not as immediately dire, was still unclear. The garden they tended together was not a magical cure-all, but rather a small oasis of calm in the midst of their respective storms. As he prepared for bed, Marcos made a decision. He would continue to nurture this unexpected friendship, not with grand gestures or promises he might not be able to keep, but with steady presence and honest conversation. In Sofia, he had found not just a friend, but a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. And in tending to the hospital garden, he had discovered a sense of purpose that his former life, for all its material success, had never provided. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months, Marcos felt ready to face it. Not with blind optimism, but with a quiet determination born from the seeds of friendship planted in an unlikely place. As weeks turned into months, Marcos found himself increasingly invested in the hospital garden. What had begun as a mandated community service had evolved into a personal mission. He spent hours researching plant care, experimenting with new varieties, and meticulously planning layouts that would provide year-round color and interest. The garden's transformation did not go unnoticed. Other patients, drawn by the vibrant blooms and peaceful atmosphere, began to frequent the space. Some, like Sofia, sought conversation and companionship. Others simply sat in quiet contemplation, finding solace among the flowers and greenery. Hi, Mrs. Touching Stories here. Enjoying the story? Subscribe now, like and comment to catch all the upcoming emotions. Marcos observed these interactions with a mixture of pride and humility, realizing that his work was having an impact far beyond mere aesthetics. However, not everyone appreciated Marcos's growing influence. Certain members of the hospital staff viewed his presence with suspicion. They questioned the wisdom of allowing a former white-collar criminal such free rein, even in something as seemingly innocuous as gardening. Whispers and sidelong glances followed Marcos as he moved through the hospital corridors. Dr. Larson, the head of oncology, was particularly vocal in his opposition. He had cornered Marcos one afternoon, his face flushed with barely contained anger. "This is not a rehabilitation center, Mr. Santos," Dr. Larson had said. "Your presence here is becoming disruptive. Patients should be focusing on their treatment, not playing in the dirt." Marcos had remained calm, explaining the therapeutic benefits of gardening and the positive feedback he had received from patients and their families. But he could see that his words fell on deaf ears. Dr. Larson had stormed off, muttering about proper protocols and liability issues. The confrontation left Marcos shaken. He had grown accustomed to the routine he had established, to the sense of purpose he had found in tending the garden and interacting with patients. The thought of losing this newfound stability filled him with dread. Sofia, ever perceptive, had noticed Marcos's unease. She did not press him for details, but her quiet support was a balm to his troubled mind. Together, they continued their work in the garden, each day bringing new challenges and small victories. As autumn approached, Marcos faced a difficult decision. His mandated community service was coming to an end, and he would soon be free to leave the hospital. The prospect, once eagerly anticipated, now filled him with conflicting emotions. He had rediscovered a passion for life within the confines of the hospital grounds, forged meaningful connections, and found a sense of purpose he had thought lost forever. But Marcos was not naive. He knew that the world beyond the hospital walls would not be as forgiving as the small community he had become a part of. His criminal record would make finding employment difficult, and his old social circles had long since abandoned him. As he tended to the late-blooming asters, Marcos pondered his options. He could try to secure a position at the hospital, perhaps expanding the gardening program to other areas. But Dr. Larson's opposition loomed large, a formidable obstacle to any such plans. Alternatively, he could strike out on his own, perhaps starting a small landscaping business. His newfound skills and passion for gardening could potentially translate into a viable career. But the thought of leaving behind the garden he had nurtured and the people he had come to care for filled him with a deep sense of loss. The sun was setting as Marcos finished his work for the day. He stood at the garden's edge, looking out over the carefully tended beds and winding paths. The future remained uncertain, fraught with challenges and potential setbacks. But as he breathed in the crisp autumn air, Marcos felt a quiet resolve settling over him. Whatever path he chose, he would face it with the same determination and care he had applied to nurturing this once-neglected patch of earth. The crisp autumn air had given way to the biting chill of early winter, when Sofia's condition took a sudden turn for the worse. Marcos had noticed her absence from the garden for several days, but he had attributed it to the cold weather. It was not until he overheard a hushed conversation between two nurses that he learned the truth. Sofia had been rushed to intensive care in the middle of the night, her body racked by a severe infection. The aggressive cancer treatments had weakened her immune system, leaving her vulnerable to complications that her fragile body struggled to fight off. The news hit Marcos like a physical blow. He had grown accustomed to Sofia's presence, her quiet strength and unwavering optimism. The thought of her lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life, brought back memories of his own darkest days. He remembered the crushing weight of despair, the feeling of utter helplessness as his carefully constructed world had crumbled around him. For days, Marcos went through the motions of tending to the garden, his movements mechanical and devoid of the passion that had previously driven him. The plants, once a source of joy and purpose, now seemed to mock him with their resilience. He found himself avoiding the section of the garden where Sofia had often sat, unable to bear the sight of her empty wheelchair. As Sofia's condition remained critical, tension within the hospital grew palpable. Dr. Larson, already skeptical of Marcos's presence, became increasingly agitated. The oncologist had cornered Marcos one afternoon, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "This is precisely why we should not encourage false hope," Dr. Larson had hissed. "Your little garden project may have provided a temporary distraction, but it did nothing to change the reality of her condition." Marcos had wanted to argue, to defend the therapeutic value of the garden and the connections it had fostered. But the words had died in his throat, choked by doubt and a gnawing sense of guilt. Had he, in his enthusiasm for the garden and the friendship he had found with Sofia, somehow lost sight of the harsh realities they both faced? As the days wore on, Marcos found himself spending more time indoors, haunting the sterile corridors of the hospital. He caught glimpses of Sofia through the window of her ICU room, her small form dwarfed by the machines that surrounded her. The sight filled him with a mixture of hope and dread, each beep and flicker of the monitors a reminder of how precarious her situation remained. One particularly bleak afternoon, Marcos had encountered Sofia's parents outside her room. They had looked at him with a mixture of recognition and uncertainty, clearly aware of his friendship with their daughter, but unsure how to interact with him in this context. The awkward silence that had stretched between them had been more painful than any words could have been. As winter tightened its grip on the city, Marcos felt his own resolve beginning to crack. The progress he had made over the past months, the sense of purpose and redemption he had found in the garden, suddenly seemed hollow in the face of Sofia's struggle. He found himself questioning everything: his presence at the hospital, his ability to make a meaningful difference, even the value of the connections he had formed. One night, unable to sleep, Marcos had ventured out into the garden. A light snow had fallen, covering the dormant plants in a delicate white blanket. As he stood there, shivering in the cold, Marcos was struck by the fragility of it all. The garden, like Sofia, like his own tentative steps towards redemption, was at the mercy of forces beyond his control. The realization did not bring comfort, but it did provide a strange sort of clarity. As Marcos made his way back inside, his breath misting in the frigid air, he knew that the coming days would test him in ways he had not anticipated. The storm that had descended upon them, Sofia's illness, his own internal struggles, the growing tensions within the hospital, was far from over. And yet, as he cast one last look at the snow-covered garden, Marcos felt a flicker of something that might have been resolve, or perhaps simply the stubborn refusal to give up without a fight. As winter's grip tightened on the city, Marcos found himself at a crossroads. The garden lay dormant under a blanket of snow, a stark reminder of the passage of time and the fragility of life. Sofia's condition remained critical, her struggle a constant undercurrent to the daily rhythms of the hospital. In the weeks that followed Sofia's sudden decline, Marcos had retreated into himself, grappling with a sense of helplessness that threatened to overwhelm him. But as the days wore on, something began to shift within him. The seeds of resilience, planted during his months of tending the garden, had taken root deeper than he had realized. Marcos began to reach out to the network of people he had connected with through the garden project. Patients, family members, and even some of the more sympathetic staff members responded to his quiet determination. They organized a rotation to sit with Sofia, reading to her, or simply providing a comforting presence. Others took up the task of maintaining the indoor plants that Marcos had introduced throughout the hospital, ensuring that even in the depths of winter, life continued to flourish. This grassroots movement did not go unnoticed. Dr. Larson watched with a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect as Marcos coordinated these efforts. The oncologist had expected the former white-collar criminal to crumble under the weight of Sofia's illness, to retreat from the hospital and the responsibilities he had taken on. Instead, Marcos seemed to be drawing strength from the very community he had helped to nurture. As he worked to rally support for Sofia, Marcos found himself reflecting on the stark contrast between his current situation and his former life. He remembered the lavish parties, the high-stakes deals, the constant pursuit of more money, more power, more prestige. That world had seemed so vital, so all-encompassing at the time. Now it felt like a distant dream, hollow and ultimately unsatisfying. Here, in the sterile corridors of the hospital and the quiet solitude of the snow-covered garden, Marcos had found something he had not even realized he was missing. The connections he had forged, the sense of purpose he had discovered in nurturing both plants and people, these were the things that now gave his life meaning. As January gave way to February, Sofia's doctors announced a crucial moment in her treatment. The next round of therapy would be particularly aggressive, with potentially severe side effects. The outcome was uncertain, but it represented their best hope for beating back the cancer that had so tenaciously clung to her body. The news sent ripples of tension through the small community that had formed around Sofia. Marcos felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. He had become, almost without realizing it, a central figure in this improvised support network. People looked to him for guidance, for reassurance, for the strength to face whatever might come. In the quiet hours of the night, Marcos found himself in the hospital's small chapel. He was not a religious man. His faith, such as it was, had been shaken long ago by the realities of the corporate world he had inhabited. But in that moment, surrounded by the flickering light of votive candles, he felt a profound sense of connection to something larger than himself. Marcos thought of Sofia, of the quiet strength she had shown throughout her ordeal. He thought of the garden, now lying dormant but ready to burst into new life with the coming of spring. And he thought of his own journey, the long and winding path that had led him to this moment. As he sat there, lost in contemplation, Marcos became aware of a presence beside him. Dr. Larson had entered the chapel silently, his face etched with the wariness of a man who had seen too much suffering. The two men sat side by side, not speaking, each lost in his own thoughts. The coming days would bring challenges that neither of them could fully anticipate. Sofia's treatment loomed on the horizon, a battle that would test not only her strength but the resolve of everyone who had come to care for her. And beyond that lay an uncertain future. For Sofia, for Marcos, for the garden project that had brought them all together. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the chapel's stained glass windows, Marcos rose to his feet. He had decisions to make, preparations to oversee. The path ahead was far from clear, but he felt, for the first time in a long while, that he was exactly where he needed to be. As February gave way to March, the first tentative signs of spring began to emerge. Tiny buds appeared on the trees surrounding the hospital, and patches of green peeked through the melting snow in the garden. Inside the hospital, a different kind of awakening was taking place. Sofia's condition, which had remained precarious for weeks, showed the first signs of improvement. Her body, battered by aggressive treatments and ravaged by infection, had begun to respond positively. The doctors, cautiously optimistic, spoke of reduced tumor markers and improving vital signs. Sofia herself, though still weak, had regained consciousness and even managed to smile at her visitors. Marcos had been a constant presence throughout Sofia's ordeal. He had divided his time between tending to the garden, coordinating the volunteer efforts, and sitting quietly by Sofia's bedside. The strain of the past weeks had left its mark on him. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his clothes hung loosely on his frame. Yet there was a new strength in his bearing, a quiet determination that had not been there before. The transformation in Marcos had not gone unnoticed. Staff members who had once viewed him with suspicion now greeted him warmly in the hallways. Patients and their families sought him out for advice or simply for a moment of companionship. Even Dr. Larson, who had been so skeptical of Marcos's presence, had begun to acknowledge the positive impact he had made. One particularly mild afternoon, Marcos had wheeled Sofia out to the garden for the first time since her relapse. The fresh air and gentle sunlight seemed to invigorate her, bringing a flush of color to her pale cheeks. As they sat together, surrounded by the first blooms of spring, Sofia had reached out and grasped Marcos's hand. The gesture, simple yet profound, spoke volumes about the bond that had formed between them. The garden itself had undergone a transformation. What had begun as Marcos's solitary project had blossomed into a community effort. Patients who were well enough to venture outside often spent time tending to the plants. Family members found solace in the quiet beauty of the space. Even some of the medical staff had taken to spending their breaks among the growing greenery. As Sofia's health continued to improve, Marcos found himself facing an unexpected dilemma. Community service was coming to an end. Soon, he would no longer have an official reason to be at the hospital. The thought of leaving, of stepping away from the life he had built here, filled him with a sense of loss he had not anticipated. One evening, as Marcos was preparing to leave for the day, he had been summoned to the hospital administrator's office. The meeting that followed would prove to be a turning point. The administrator, impressed by the positive changes Marcos had brought about, offered him a permanent position overseeing the garden project and coordinating volunteer efforts. The offer had caught Marcos off guard. He had spent so long focused on the present, on the day-to-day challenges of Sofia's illness and the needs of the garden, that he had given little thought to his future beyond his mandated service. The prospect of continuing the work he had begun both thrilled and terrified him. As he left the administrator's office, his mind whirling with possibilities, Marcos had encountered Dr. Larson in the hallway. The oncologist, who had once been his harshest critic, looked at him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Dr. Larson had asked about the meeting, his tone neutral but his eyes keen. Marcos had hesitated, unsure how to respond. Hi, Mrs. Touching Stories here. Enjoying the story? Subscribe now, like and comment to catch all the upcoming emotions. The two men had come a long way from their initial antagonism, but there was still a wariness between them. Finally, Marcos had shared the news of the job offer. Dr. Larson's response had been unexpected. The oncologist had nodded, a faint smile touching his lips, and said simply that perhaps there was more than one way to heal. As March progressed, bringing with it longer days and the promise of renewal, Marcos found himself at another crossroads. The decision before him was not an easy one. Accepting the position would mean fully embracing this new life he had stumbled into, with all its challenges and uncertainties. It would mean letting go of any lingering hopes of returning to his old world of corporate success and material wealth. Yet as Marcos watched Sofia take her first unassisted steps in the garden, as he saw the joy on the faces of patients and families enjoying the space he had helped create, he felt a sense of purpose that he had never known in his previous life. The path ahead was far from clear, but for the first time in a long while, Marcos felt ready to face whatever challenges it might bring. The spring air was filled with the scent of new growth and possibility. As Marcos turned to head back inside, he caught sight of his reflection in a window. The man looking back at him was not the same one who had arrived at the hospital months ago, bitter and resentful. This man, weathered by hardship but strengthened by purpose, stood tall and unafraid. Whatever the future might hold, Marcos knew that he had found something here that he was not willing to let go. As spring blossomed into summer, the hospital garden flourished under Marcos's careful tending. The once barren courtyard had transformed into a vibrant oasis, teeming with life and color. It was against this backdrop of renewal that Sofia's journey at the hospital came to an end. On a warm June morning, Sofia stood at the hospital's entrance, her belongings packed and ready for departure. The frail, despondent woman who had arrived months ago was gone, replaced by someone who, while still bearing the physical marks of her ordeal, radiated a quiet strength. Marcos stood beside her, a steadying presence as she prepared to take her first steps back into the world beyond the hospital walls. The moment was bittersweet. Sofia's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous, a testament to her resilience and the care she had received. Yet for Marcos, her departure marked the end of a chapter that had profoundly altered the course of his life. As he watched Sofia climb into the waiting car, Marcos felt a complex mix of emotions: joy at her recovery, pride in the role he had played, and a lingering sense of uncertainty about what would come next. In the days that followed Sofia's discharge, Marcos found himself at the center of unexpected attention. The hospital administration, impressed by the positive impact of the garden project, had decided to formally recognize his contributions. A small ceremony was organized, attended by staff, patients, and their families. Dr. Larson, in a surprising turn, had been the one to present Marcos with a plaque commemorating his work. As he accepted the recognition, Marcos had felt a surreal sense of disconnect. The corporate world he had once inhabited had been full of such ceremonies: awards, promotions, accolades for financial success. Yet, this simple acknowledgement, given in a hospital courtyard surrounded by the garden he had nurtured, held a weight that no previous honor had matched. In the quiet moments following the ceremony, Marcos had retreated to a secluded corner of the garden. He sat on a bench, the plaque resting in his lap, and allowed himself to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this point. He thought of the man he had been when he first arrived at the hospital, angry, resentful, seeing his community service as nothing more than a punishment to be endured. That man seemed like a stranger now. In his place was someone who had discovered a sense of purpose in the most unexpected of places. Marcos had learned to find joy in the simple act of nurturing growth, both in plants and in people. He had witnessed the power of compassion and community to heal wounds that went beyond the physical. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Marcos made a decision. The offer of a permanent position at the hospital still stood, and he now knew with certainty that he would accept it. The thought of returning to his old life, with its hollow pursuit of wealth and status, no longer held any appeal. This decision, Marcos realized, was not just about a job. It represented a fundamental shift in his values, a reorientation of his entire life. The skills he had honed in the corporate world, his ability to organize, to motivate, to see the big picture, could be put to use here in service of something greater than personal gain. As he stood to leave, Marcos caught sight of Dr. Larson watching him from a distance. The oncologist nodded, a gesture of respect between two men who had started as adversaries and ended as something approaching friends. In that moment, Marcos understood that his transformation had not gone unnoticed, that it had, in its own way, impacted those around him. The path ahead was not without its challenges. Marcos knew that there would be difficult days, that not every patient's story would have a happy ending like Sofia's. The work he had chosen was not easy, and it would demand more of him than any corporate job ever had. Yet, as he walked back towards the hospital, Marcos felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for much of his life. He had found his place, not in the corner offices of skyscrapers, but in the quiet corners of a hospital garden. Here, among the blooming flowers and healing souls, Marcos had discovered a richness that no amount of money could buy. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Another day was ending, but for Marcos, it felt like the beginning of something new. He took a deep breath, savoring the scent of earth and growing things, and stepped forward into his future.